He has many names: Puff Daddy, Puffy, Puff, Brother Love, P. Diddy, and of course Diddy. Soon he could be known just by a federal inmate number. Sean Combs has had a lot of names throughout his career, but he's also had a lot of names for other people who are now at the center of his sex trafficking and racketeering trial. From the endearing names he had for people like baby girl, to the kind of names that we cannot say on air, and why one particular name made a person very important to this case very uncomfortable. We're on the case, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Sean Combs is apparently doing whatever he can to score points with the jury in his trial, as government witnesses take the stand and allege that he was physically abusive and sexually abusive, and he did whatever he could to get people to do what he wanted them to do. This week, in the eyes of the judge, some of what Combs has been doing in court apparently crossed the line. The prosecution brought up that Diddy has been apparently nodding during certain times of testimony and even nodding at jurors. And the judge said, without the jury present, that if Diddy continued to do that, he could be removed from the courtroom. We've already talked about some of the games that the defense may be trying to play with jurors already. Combs has worn sweaters and khaki outfits to court compared to the flashy suits you might expect a media mogul to wear. Sean Combs inside the court may be trying to create a perception of being softer than the person at the center of the harsh testimony that we have heard through several weeks of government witnesses. People that have said that Sean Combs was much more than just the mega superstar so many of us grew up with. Take how Sean Combs referred to Cassie Ventura, the on-again, off-again girlfriend at the center of this case, after she went on the stand and testified to prosecutors that she was forced to take part in drug-fueled sex parties called freak-offs. Sean Combs' defense cross-examined Ventura, and they tried to make the argument that she was a willing participant in the freak-offs, and they also argued that the text messages between the two in their relationship showed that Cassie not only helped plan these freak-offs, but she stayed in this alleged abusive relationship with Combs because she loved him and he loved her. Diddy called Cassie in text messages BG, which she said meant baby girl. Diddy also called Cassie CC, and that supposedly stood for Cassie Combs. But on the flip side, Cassie had names for Diddy as well. Particularly this one has stood out in the trial, Pop Pop. And it's kind of weird and it's kind of uncomfortable when you think about it. The prosecution asked Cassie why she called Diddy Pop Pop, and she said there was a period early on in our relationship where he wanted me to have a nickname for him and I didn't want to call him anything that anyone else had called him, so he asked me what I called my grandfather, and I said Pop Pop. The prosecutor asked how she felt about that, and Cassie said, quote, "I thought it was weird at the time, and now I just feel like it was disrespectful." But the defense pointed out that Cassie used that term several times in text messages, like in this one where she says, "You hungry, Pop Pop?" and Diddy says no. The fact that Cassie testifies that she felt it was weird that she was calling the man that she was allegedly being forced to take part in freak-offs with by her grandfather's name, but used that in communication with Combs, is an example of the argument at the center of this case. The prosecution laying out allegations of sex trafficking and racketeering, but the defense arguing back, saying there are examples that show that the people who are testifying were not forced to take part in many of the things Sean Combs is accused of, but they were willing participants. Testimony also shows how quickly Diddy's mood would allegedly change. I counted that the B word has come up in testimony more than a dozen times so far in this trial. The defense may say Combs called Cassie baby girl and Cassie Combs, but at least one witness says his favorite names for Ventura were actually the kind that no one's mom wants them saying on the air. Celebrity stylist Deontay Nash testified that he witnessed several occasions where Combs physically assaulted Cassie, one time allegedly, to the point that she hit her head on a bed frame and it created so much blood they had to use a towel to clean it up. He said that Combs's favorite names for Cassie were, along with those loving names, the B word and words that begin with an S and an H that refer to prostitutes, but the B word, that was Diddy's favorite. Male escort Daniel Phillip, you might remember him going going by the name The Punisher, who testified that he took part in a freak-off with Cassie and Combs. He says that he witnessed Combs drag Ventura into a room during a freak-off and called her what was his apparent favorite word for his girlfriend. Another victim, the woman who went by the pseudonym Mia, in court testimony, said that Combs physically and sexually assaulted her. And she told a story where Combs allegedly chased her around on a yacht near the posh Caribbean island of St. Bart's in 2010 or 2011. And Mia says that Combs yelled, quote, "You better learn how to walk on water like Jesus, B-word." She said that the crew helped her escape on a smaller boat and get ashore, but that Combs ordered her to return to the yacht. Now, we have heard story after story in court of Sean Combs trying to be an imposing figure. You might remember Kid Cudi talking about how Combs looked like a, quote, Marvel supervillain when he met Diddy after Combs allegedly tried to blow up Kid Cudi's car in 2011 because he was reportedly jealous of his relationship with Cassie. Another victim who took the stand was Brianna Bongalin. She was a friend of Cassie Ventura, and she said in 2016, Sean Combs lifted her over a 17-story balcony and then threw her on a coffee table. And here's a line that the government is hoping will hit home with the jury. Bongalin claims that Combs said, quote, "I'm the devil and I could kill you." That's perhaps the most direct threat that Combs has allegedly made per testimony in this trial. The defense pushed back on Bongalin's claim by pointing to her not remembering the amount of drugs that she was allegedly on that night. Then there's the name for the man who Combs thought was helping him get rid of a tape that might have stopped him from getting into the situation that he's in right now. The man's name is Eddie Garcia. He's not a celebrity, he's not a major player, but he was a security guard at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles in 2016 when Combs attacked Cassie Ventura when she was allegedly trying to escape a freak-off. Garcia saw the tape and says that he was hounded by Diddy's team, including his chief of staff, Christina Coram, who he said called him at work. He says she came to the hotel in person and even she found his personal phone number, all in an effort to get rid of that video. Eventually, Combs offered Garcia 50 grand for the video, and Garcia said when he told Combs that he had a deal, any sort of pressure that Combs and company were putting on this minimum wage security guard went away, and suddenly he was known as Eddie, my angel. Other than a phone call on Easter, Eddie said he never heard from Combs again, up until he testified in front of him this week in court. At the top of each transcript, if anyone has a lot of names, it's the defendant himself, Sean Combs. He burst onto the music scene in the 90s as Puff Daddy, then he went by Puff, the name many of his employees called him. Combs said Puff came from a childhood demeanor where he would huff and puff and have a temper that apparently did not go away as he aged. Then he became P. Diddy, and that reportedly was because the notorious B.I.G. called him that before Biggie Smalls was killed in a drive-by shooting in 1997 in Los Angeles. It also came at a time where Combs was in legal trouble and may have needed a fresh restart when it came to his public image. He eventually shortened his name to Diddy. The reason for that, reportedly, was it was easier for fans to chant at concerts. But before going back to Diddy, he did try to go by Love or Brother Love, but that didn't really stick and he went back to Diddy. Now, as the man behind the names being painted by the government comes to light, it is possible that the huff and puff attitude of his youth could put him in prison for life. But Combs is pleading not guilty. His trial is expected to go for several more weeks. He's charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Again, he has pleaded not guilty. Joining us now is Dr. Zeev Cohen, a board-certified forensic psychiatrist and the founder of Principium Psychiatry. Thank you for taking the time to be with us on Law and Crime to help us just kind of break down what we're reading in these transcripts and hearing from the courtroom about these relationships that Sean Diddy Combs had and the names that he used for people. What has stood out to you thus far as everything Diddy allegedly has been put on display through the first couple weeks of this trial?
Well, I think that, we're hearing a lot about really extreme sexual behavior. I'll caveat by saying I am a psychiatrist. Of course, I'm not here to diagnose P. Diddy. I've never evaluated him, but I can just talk about some of the things that we're hearing and the patterns that it makes us think about as mental health experts and, how it relates to, in general, to our work. So, this type of sexual behavior, when you hear about sexual behavior like that, we certainly would classify it as fairly extreme, having sexual freak-offs, what the language that they're using, where sex would go on for 24 to 30 hours. That's certainly typically something that we think about when we do our clinical work as a kind of compulsive and addictive sexual behavior. And when it's combined with drug use, which is what I'm hearing from published reports, that is often a pattern that we see. For example, we'll see people who use crystal meth or ecstasy. They have an addiction to crystal meth or ecstasy, but it also combines with a sexual addiction. And so there's this hedonic sort of pleasure-seeking behavior that becomes very compulsive, and it can go on for days at a time. So that's definitely I think the first thing that stands out in terms of the testimony that we've been hearing.
And let's dive into some of the names. I think the relationship with Cassie Ventura has been really at the forefront throughout several weeks. It all seems to come back to her. And some of the names that he had for her, we found very interesting. When seemed to be going well, he called her baby girl. He called her Cassie Combs, his last name. And then on the flip side of it, you have witnesses who say his favorite word for her was the B word. And he would call her names that we probably can't say on the air, but names that are associated with prostitutes. What stands out to you when you look at the relationship they had and the names that he had for her?
For sure. So, again, with the caveat, obviously, that I can't diagnose him, and haven't evaluated him. But in terms of what typically when we see intimate partner relationships that vacillate between idealization and devaluation, we're often thinking of it. Often makes you think about relationships where one partner is exercising coercive control. So it's something that I see a lot in my clinical work and as a forensic psychiatrist. If you have someone that will, sweet talk the partner, love bomb, quote unquote, the partner, and then they suddenly switch to more abusive and derogatory language, that kind of vacillation, it really puts the other member of the relationship off balance. They don't know what to expect. They don't know which version of their partner they're going to be dealing with at every given time. And so often it's a dynamic that can be used to exert power and control over the partner in the relationship.
There was another name in the relationship that Cassie said she felt it was weird when she first started calling him this name, and then she eventually felt it was disrespectful. And it was Pop Pop is the name that she had for him because he asked her what she called her grandfather, and that's what he wanted to be called. Clearly, with the type of relationship they had and what she said, it's odd that you would call this person the name that you called your grandfather growing up. But what as a psychiatrist stands out to you about that dynamic?
For sure. So I think that we like to pay attention closely to language in mental health. It expresses a lot. Often language is very symbolic and meaningful. Again, unable to diagnose him specifically, but when I hear about in my clinical work somebody who wants to be associated with an authority figure or an older person in the context of an intimate relationship, often, again, there are dynamics of power and control. It may sometimes indicate, for example, an unstable identity in the person who wants to take on a persona of an authority figure towards their partner. And it can sometimes also indicate sexual perversions. So, there are perversions where somebody would, or what we call paraphilias, where somebody wants to, enact sadomasochistic behavior towards a sexual partner. And part of that is adopting a persona that is not their own persona. So I think that, when you're looking at the sexual behavior and the language together, those are certainly interesting to think about.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting. Another name that stood out to us was, and he's not someone who is a big name celebrity. We may not remember his name by the end of this trial, but it's this man, Eddie Garcia. He was a security guard at the Intercontinental Hotel. He has the tape of Sean Combs attacking Cassie Ventura. We eventually all saw it, but in 2016, he has it. And there was this pressure campaign that was put on by Combs' legal team, or Combs, not his legal team, but the people who are close to him, Christina Coram, his chief of staff, to get this tape. And in the transcript, it stood out to me that once Diddy has a deal with this guy, it's Eddie, my angel, was the name he called him. And then the mood completely changes. When you look at the way Diddy handled business, what stands out to you just from your professional perspective, even though you are, we haven't met Diddy personally, we haven't been able to diagnose him.
Yeah, I think that again, I think when we see patterns of really denigrating a person or exerting a lot of aggression towards a person, so if I see that in a clinical situation, and that aggression can be sexualized, or it can be in a business context, right? It can be in a variety of settings. When someone does that kind of behavior, and then on the flip side, they can love bomb the person or be very affectionate, it generally makes me think about manipulative tendencies to want to exert power and control. And we often see these types of patterns in coercive relationships. So for example, if I'm taking care of a woman or a man who's been subject to domestic violence, that's something that we often hear, right? When he's sweet, he's the sweetest. He is the most affectionate partner I've ever had when he's in a good mood. And I just feel like I'm on cloud nine. And then he can turn on a dime, or if he's drinking, or if something goes wrong at work, and all of a sudden he's a monster, right? So that is something that we often see described by victims of domestic violence.
Some may look at Sean Combs because of the successful business person he was, and you've even had some of these witnesses who will say nice things about him even after they go on the stand and say that they witnessed some difficult things. And they may look at Sean Combs, the business person, and just say he was an aggressive boss. They hear this testimony and he was someone who, business to some point is manipulating people, trying to get people to do. At what point does the line get crossed where you go from being an aggressive boss, a little bit too much attention to detail, micromanaging, to past the point where someone may have, and I'm not saying he has a mental health condition, but something that crosses the line to where it's no longer inbounds?
I think it's such a good question and so fascinating to think about. And I agree with you that manipulation in and of itself is not always a bad thing. Everyone has to manipulate certain situations to their advantage. And that doesn't mean that you're a sociopath or a psychopath. I think that in general, we think about how pervasive is a person's manipulative tendencies across relationships and across settings, and also how extreme it is and how much aggression is involved. So I think that certainly P. Diddy, when you listen to some of the testimony and the evidence that's been introduced, he does seem to have operated in gray areas. For example, we heard testimony, I believe, from Jane yesterday, where she was saying that she engaged in these sex acts because he was paying her rent. He was paying her $10,000 a month rent. So it's this gray area of, was that voluntary? But did she view this as an exchange for rent? Or did it really cross the line in terms of actually coercive control and abuse? And I think that ultimately, of course, this is what the jury is going to decide. The fact finder will decide. No mental health expert or anybody else is going to decide that question. But I think it is a challenge for the jury. I also think that that's why presumably P. Diddy didn't think he was doing anything wrong. He may have felt that all these people are voluntarily, he's paying the escorts, he's supporting financially his girlfriends. Nobody is, being compelled. Nobody's locked in a cage. People are coming and going from these hotel rooms. And he may have felt that what he was doing, individuals were voluntarily participating in. But on the other hand, there were drugs involved, right? He's also a very powerful, wealthy man, which is very intimidating. He's a celebrity, which also is intimidating. And I do think on the cultural commentary side, I think celebrities occupy a very interesting place in the American psyche. I think on one hand, we expect more of celebrities, right? We kind of hold them to a higher standard. We expect them to exhibit very, very ethical behavior. If P. Diddy wasn't a celebrity, would this case have resulted in these charges? I don't know. But on the other hand, often in American life, in reality, celebrities get away with a lot that regular folks don't get away with. And so I think that it's very complicated to see how the legal system is trying to hold P. Diddy account to behavior which is appalling and nobody on a moral or ethical perspective, no one would praise this behavior. But from a legal perspective, I think it does seem to often occupy a gray zone.
Yeah, it's interesting because defendants, he's pleaded not guilty. So at least publicly, he will say, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't think it was wrong. He did have that Instagram video after the Intercontinental Hotel incident came to light, saying that he was at his lowest point and all of that. In your experience, when dealing with people accused of crimes where we obviously look at the video and you can see that this is wrong, and the things that were dangling someone over a 17-story balcony, like another witness testified this week, allegedly, that's clearly wrong. But then in the mind of people who are accused of these things, how often did they think that what was going on was not even in the gray area? They didn't realize it was wrong.
Right. And I think, to speaking to that also, of course, there is very strong evidence of domestic violence. And I would just make the point that my previous answer was really referring to the sexual behaviors, because I don't believe he's actually up on any charges right now on domestic violence. It's all on,
No.
Coercion, prostitution, and things like that. So the domestic violence is kind of a separate matter, but of course, psychologically, it's linked to everything else that's going on. Yeah, I think that in his own, I think that, again, I can't speak to P. Diddy specifically, but I think perpetrators in general, they often rationalize their behavior. And we see that across criminal defendants in a variety of settings, not just sexual, but any types of crimes, financial crimes, and others. So when you talk to defendants, they usually have a rationale that in their mind mitigates their responsibility or makes them less responsible. Obviously, in the eyes of the law, we don't typically agree with them with their self-assessment, but it seems to be part of how individuals process decisions to transgress the law.
What what do you make of it was yesterday in court that the prosecution raised the concern that Diddy apparently was making a little bit too much eye contact with the jury, apparently nodding at the jury a little bit. What does that tell you about Sean Combs, that he may be trying to play some mind games with the jurors where, if any of us were probably facing the charges he would, you'd probably follow the rules that the judge gave, but it appears that, he's, one could look at what he was being accused of as trying to tip the scales and score some points in a subtle way.
For sure. I think that, just from a courtroom expertise perspective, people who work in courts, attorneys, experts, we know that defendants are going to be motivated to present themselves in the best possible way to the jury, to be appealing. And I think that celebrities in particular do that. This reminds me of the Johnny Depp trial, obviously a very different situation, but I think one of the reasons Johnny Depp had a successful outcome from his perspective was that he really connected with the jury, particularly when he was testifying. I think it's hard to control this type of interaction between the defendant and the jury when we're just talking about nonverbal interaction as he's sitting at the defense table. And I also want to say, apropos of your point, that we all manipulate on a daily basis. The fact, if he was trying to manipulate the jury or to influence them in his favor, that would be a very natural instinct. It seems like the judge is particularly worried about it because P. Diddy is a highly charismatic person and he's a celebrity. And so there's a heightened anxiety that he could have undue influence on the jury, even through nonverbal communication. My own perspective is that this is a little exaggerated. This is nonverbal communication. These are glances with his eyes. But I do understand where the judge's concern is coming from.
And then just lastly, Doctor, with your experience, your line of work, and seeing all the details that seem to come out every day in this case, what's it been like for you following the Diddy trial through the first couple of weeks?
I think it's been really interesting. I think on the one hand, like most people, a lot of what we're hearing is appalling and sometimes even disgusting, right? So these are things that are upsetting to hear about. There's also a little bit of an experience of where it feels a little bit surreal to see these things in print, in everyday publications, your opening newspapers that you read, and they're filled with incredibly graphic information that we don't typically see in a newspaper. So I think that's kind of an interesting experience. I guess I worry a little bit about how this is impacting the public, whether it's normalizing certain types of behavior. I think a lot of the media coverage is being very sensational and might not be that healthy for the public the way the trial is being covered. On the other hand, I think that if, like you're doing in this show, when you're trying to bring a mental health perspective to these issues, and we're having the opportunity now to talk about domestic violence, to talk about coercive control, I think that, of course, can be very helpful for the public. So I think it's important for the media to think a little bit about what is the most ethical way to cover this trial.
No, and I think that's a great point, because the world is certainly watching. I mean, he's someone we all grew up with in a lot of ways, but I mean, he's someone who transcends communities, and everybody has an opinion on this trial. And to remember, I mean, some of the testimony we're hearing, they're allegations, but just very traumatic experiences that people are talking about on the witness stand. Dr. Zeev Cohen, great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.